The first time Nora Whitmore saw blood on her hands. She was 22 years old and kneeling beside her dying father in the cramped general store he had spent 30 years building in Deadwood, South Dakota. It was the spring of 1878, and the gold rush had transformed the Black Hills into a lawless paradise where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card, where men killed for a pouch of dust, and where a woman alone had about as much chance of survival as a newborn lamb in a den of wolves. Her father had taken a bullet meant for someone else, caught in the crossfire of a saloon brawl that spilled into the street. The doctor said he had maybe an hour, but Samuel Whitmore lasted 3 days, long enough to make Nora promise she would keep the store running, that she would not sell to those vultures circling already, that she would stay strong. She buried him on a hillside overlooking the gulch, and when she returned to the store, she found the shelves half empty. Someone had robbed her while she laid her father to rest. The sheriff, a man named Bullock who actually tried to maintain some semblance of law in this chaos, promised to investigate, but they both knew the truth. In Deadwood, you protected what was yours or you lost it. Nora had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a shopkeeper who dreamed of striking it rich. Her mother had died of fever when Nora was 16, and her father had dragged her west 2 years later, convinced that supplying miners would prove more profitable than being one. He had been right for a time. The store had done well. But Samuel Whitmore had been a gentle man in a hard place, extending credit to those who could not pay, offering shelter to those caught in storms, believing that kindness would be repaid with kindness. His daughter had no such illusions. She stood behind the counter that first week alone, a loaded shotgun resting where her father used to keep his ledger, and when drunk miners came in demanding whiskey on credit, she told them to get out. When a group of claim jumpers tried to intimidate her into selling, she raised that shotgun and told them she would shoot the first man who touched her property. They laughed, but something in her eyes must have convinced them because they left. Still, she was drowning. The supplies she needed came from freight wagons that charged outrageous prices. The miners who had owed her father money conveniently forgot their debts. She raised her prices to compensate, but that only drove away the honest customers. Within a month, she was eating 1 meal a day, watered-down soup made from whatever vegetables she could afford. Within 2 months, she had sold her mother's wedding ring to pay a debt to the freight company. She had never felt hunger like this before. Not the simple emptiness before supper, but the gnawing, constant ache that made her hands shake and her vision blur. She grew thinner, her dresses hanging loose on a frame that had once been pleasantly curved. Her blonde hair, which her mother had always said was her finest feature, became dull and brittle. She stopped looking in the mirror. It was late June when the mountain man first walked into her store. Nora had been tallying her pathetic inventory, trying to figure out if she could make it through another week, when the door opened and a wall of muscle and fur stepped through. He had to duck beneath the frame, and when he straightened, he seemed to fill the entire shop. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they strained against the buckskin shirt he wore. His hair was dark brown, long enough to brush his collar, and he had several days of beard growth shadowing a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. His arms, visible where his sleeves were rolled up, were thick with muscle, corded and powerful. Everything about him spoke of strength and survival, but it was his eyes that caught her. They were a startling pale blue, like a winter sky, and they held an intelligence and wariness that reminded her of the wolves she sometimes heard howling in the hills. "Help you?" Nora asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. She had learned not to show fear. "Need supplies," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like he did not use it often. "Flour, salt, coffee, sugar, ammunition if you have it." "I have it," she said. "Money first." Something flickered in those blue eyes. Amusement, maybe. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. When he set it on the counter, it made a heavy thud. Gold dust. Nora's hands did not shake as she weighed it. She had gotten good at that, at least. It was more than enough for what he wanted. She gathered the supplies, her movements efficient despite her weakness. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. He watched her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow did not. When she pushed the supplies across the counter, he did not immediately take them. "You are Samuel Whitmore's daughter," he said. It was not a question. "I am." "Heard he died." 2 months ago, he nodded slowly. "Heard you are running the store alone." "I am." "Heard you are doing a poor job of it." That stung, probably because it was true. Nora lifted her chin. "Then take your business elsewhere." To her surprise, he smiled. It transformed his face, softening the harsh lines, making him look younger. Maybe 30, she thought, though it was hard to tell with men who lived in the mountains. "Did not say I agreed with what I heard, just said I heard it." He gathered his supplies, but instead of leaving, he stood there studying her. Nora was suddenly, painfully aware of how she must look, thin and tired, worn down by worry and hunger and grief. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "That is none of your concern." "When?" There was something in his voice, a note of command that made her answer before she thought better of it. "Yesterday." He set the supplies back down. "You got a stove in the back." "What does that matter?" "Answer the question." "Yes." He picked up the sack of flour and the salt and walked toward the back room like he owned the place. Nora hurried after him. "What do you think you are doing? Making you something to eat." He found her stove, examined it, nodded in satisfaction. "You got a pan." "I do not need your charity." He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was so stern, so uncompromising that she actually took a step back. "You are starving yourself to death. That is not noble, girl. That is stupid. Now get me a pan and sit down before you fall down." No one had spoken to her like that since her father died. No one had cared enough to notice she was starving. Something in Nora's chest cracked, and she found herself sitting at the small table in the corner, watching as this strange mountain man moved through her kitchen like he knew what he was doing. He made flapjacks, simple and quick, and when he set a plate in front of her, the smell alone made her stomach clench with need. But he was watching her, and she had her pride. "Eat," he said. "I am fine. Eat, or I will feed you myself." She believed him. Nora picked up her fork and took a bite. The flapjack was plain, just flour and water and a pinch of salt, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She had to force herself to eat slowly, to not shovel it into her mouth like an animal. He made more, a whole stack of them, and watched as she ate. When she finally pushed the plate away, unable to take another bite, she felt almost human again. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. "Name's Pierce Patterson. Most people call me Pierce. Nora Whitmore." "I know." He poured himself coffee from the pot he had made, leaning against the counter. "I trap in the Black Hills. Beaver mostly, some fox and marten. Come into town maybe 4 times a year for supplies." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I will be back," he said simply. "And when I come back, I expect to find you still alive and running this store. You understand?" "I do not need." "Everyone needs help sometimes," he interrupted. "Your father gave me credit when I first came to these hills, said I could pay him when I had the furs to sell. Most men would not have done that for a stranger. I am repaying that kindness." He finished his coffee and gathered his supplies. At the door, he paused. "There is extra gold in that pouch, enough to buy decent supplies from the freight company. Do not waste it on credit for men who will not pay you back." Then he was gone, leaving Nora sitting in her back room, feeling more confused than she had felt in months. She opened the pouch after he left and found he had been right. There was nearly twice what the supplies had cost. She sat there holding it, this gift from a stranger, this mountain man who had bullied her into eating and then disappeared into the hills. That night, for the first time since her father died, Nora did not cry herself to sleep. Pierce Patterson came back 6 weeks later, in the middle of August when the heat turned deadwood into an oven and the creek ran low and sluggish. Nora was helping a customer when he walked in, and she was shocked by the relief she felt. She had thought about him more than she wanted to admit, wondered if he was real or if she had dreamed him up in a moment of desperate hunger. But no, he was real. Just as massive, just as intimidating, though this time she noticed details she had missed before. The way he moved, graceful despite his size. The way his eyes scanned the room, taking in everything, missing nothing. The way several customers suddenly remembered they had business elsewhere. He waited until the store was empty, then approached the counter. "You look better." She did. The extra gold had allowed her to buy better supplies, to eat regularly, to stop the downward spiral that had been killing her. She had even gained back some of the weight she had lost, her dresses fitting properly again. "Thanks to you," she said. He shrugged like it was nothing. "Need more supplies." They conducted their business, and this time when he paid, it was the exact amount. He did not offer charity again, but when he was done, he did not leave immediately. "You had dinner?" he asked. "Not yet." "There is a decent place down the street. The widow Murphy runs it. Let me buy you a meal." It was not really a question, but Nora found herself nodding anyway. She closed the store, something she rarely did, and walked with him down the muddy street to the boarding house where Mrs. Murphy served meals to those who could pay. The widow took one look at Pierce and her eyes lit up. "Pierce Patterson, I have not seen you since spring. Come in, come in." And Miss Whitmore, what a surprise. They ate beef stew and fresh bread, and Mrs. Murphy fussed over them like a mother hen. Pierce ate with the focused attention of a man who did not take food for granted, but between bites, he asked Nora questions. About the store, about Deadwood, about her life before the Black Hills. She found herself talking, really talking, in a way she had not since her father died. She told him about Ohio, about her mother's flower garden, about her father's dreams. She told him about the loneliness of running the store alone, about the miners who tried to cheat her, about the constant worry that she would fail. He listened without judgment, without interruption, and when she finally ran out of words, he told her about his life. He had come west after the war, looking for silence and space after too many years of blood and noise. He had learned to trap from a French-Canadian voyageur, had spent winters alone in the mountains, had come to prefer the company of animals to men. "You not get lonely?" Nora asked. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I have known loneliness in crowded rooms. Better to be alone in the mountains than alone in a city." She understood that. She had been surrounded by people since her father died, but she had never felt more isolated. When Pierce walked her back to the store, the sun was setting, painting the gulch in shades of gold and crimson. At her door he stopped. "I will be back in a month," he said, "going up to the high country before the snow comes." "Be safe," she said and meant it. He smiled, that same transforming smile from before. "Always am." Then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering darkness like a ghost, and Nora went inside to her empty store and her empty rooms and realized with a start that she was looking forward to seeing him again. The pattern continued through the fall and into winter. Pierce came to town every few weeks, always buying supplies, always checking on her. Sometimes he brought fresh meat, a deer he had shot or rabbits he had snared, claiming he had extra and did not want it to go to waste. Sometimes he fixed things around the store that needed fixing, a loose board here, a broken shelf there. He never asked permission, just did what needed doing. And always, he made sure she ate. Nora found herself watching for him, listening for his heavy tread on the boardwalk outside. She told herself it was just gratitude, that she appreciated his help and nothing more. But she could not explain why her heart beat faster when he walked through the door, or why she started taking more care with her appearance on the days she thought he might come to town. It was late October when everything changed. 3 men came into the store just before closing. Nora recognized them as part of a gang that operated out of a claim near Poker Gulch, mean and violent even by Deadwood standards. Their leader was a man named Virgil Cross, and he had a reputation for taking what he wanted. "Evening, Miss Whitmore," Cross said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Hear you have been doing well lately, making a real go of this place. What do you want?" Nora kept her hand near the shotgun. "Just to talk business. See, my boys and we need a steady supplier, someone we can count on, and we thought, why not support a local establishment?" "I am not interested." Cross's smile faded. "Now, that is not very neighborly. See, we would be very good customers, buy a lot of supplies. Course, we would expect a discount, call it a partnership. Get out." "I do not think you understand the situation," Cross said, stepping closer. His men flanked him, blocking the door. "You are all alone here. Accidents happen. Be a shame if something happened to this store, or to you." Nora's hand closed on the shotgun, but before she could raise it, the door behind Cross's men opened and Pierce stepped through. He did not say anything. He just stood there, filling the doorway, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cross turned and Nora saw something flicker in his eyes. "Fear." "Patterson," Cross said. "This does not concern you. Leave," Pierce said. One word spoken quietly but with absolute authority. "Now listen here." Pierce moved. Nora barely saw it, he was so fast. One moment he was standing by the door. The next he had Cross by the throat, lifting him off his feet like he weighed nothing. The other 2 men reached for their guns, but Pierce looked at them and they froze. "She said get out," Pierce said, his voice still quiet but somehow more terrifying for it. "You are not welcome here. You do not come back. You do not bother her again. You understand?" Cross made a choking sound. Pierce dropped him and the man stumbled backward, gasping for air. "We understand," one of the other men said quickly, grabbing Cross's arm. "Come on, Virgil, let's go." They left, practically running, and Pierce calmly closed the door behind them and locked it. Then he turned to Nora. "You all right?" She was shaking, she realized. The shotgun was still in her hands, but her fingers had gone numb. "I am fine." He crossed the room in 3 strides and gently took the shotgun from her, setting it aside. His hands were enormous, scarred and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "You are safe now." And that was when Nora started to cry. Not delicate tears, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, all the fear and loneliness and desperation she had been holding back for months. She cried for her father, for her lost dreams, for the terror of facing men like Cross alone. Pierce did not tell her to stop. He did not offer empty platitudes. He just pulled her into his arms and held her, one massive hand stroking her hair, and let her cry until she had nothing left. When she finally pulled away, embarrassed and exhausted, he produced a handkerchief from somewhere and handed it to her. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not be. I do not usually fall apart like that." "You have earned the right to fall apart," Pierce said. "You have been strong for a long time. Sometimes being strong means knowing when to let go." She looked up at him, this mountain man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying, and something shifted inside her, something fundamental and terrifying and wonderful. "Why?" she asked. Why do you keep helping me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes searching her face. "You want the truth, always. First time I saw you, you were standing behind this counter looking like you would fight the whole world before you would give up. You were half-starved and running on stubbornness alone, but you had not quit. I admired that. Reminded me of a wounded animal I once found in the mountains, a fox caught in a trap. Could have bitten me when I freed her, but she did not. She trusted me. You had that same look in your eyes. Wary, but not broken." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Then I got to know you. Got to see that you were not just stubborn, but brave. Not just surviving, but building something. And I realized I looked forward to coming to town, which I had not done in 10 years. Started finding excuses to make the trip more often." Nora's breath caught. "Pierce, I know it is not proper," he said quickly. "I know I am just a mountain man with nothing to offer but furs and a cabin in the woods, but I wanted you to know. You deserve to know that someone sees you. That someone cares." She was trembling again, but not from fear this time. "What if I told you that I look forward to your visits too, that I have been watching for you, hoping you would come?" His eyes widened slightly. "Are you saying, I am saying that I care about you too, Pierce Patterson? I am saying that you are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I sleep. I am saying that I have never felt safer than when you are near." He cupped her face in his hands, so gentle despite his strength. "Nora, yes. I would very much like to kiss you right now." "Then do it." He did. His lips were surprisingly soft, and he kissed her like she was something precious, something to be cherished. Nora had been kissed before, clumsy attempts by boys in Ohio who did not know what they were doing, but this was different. This was a man who knew exactly what he wanted, and what he wanted was her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Pierce rested his forehead against hers. "I do not have much to offer," he said. "My cabin is small and rough, the winters are hard, it is a lonely life." "It would not be lonely if I was there," Nora said. He pulled back to look at her. "You would give up the store, the town." She looked around at the shop her father had built, at the life she had been clinging to out of obligation and fear. "My father wanted me to be happy. This store was his dream, not mine. And I think I have been so busy trying to survive that I forgot to think about what I actually want." "What do you want, you?" she said simply. "I want you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. "Then you will have me, for as long as you want me." "That might be a very long time, good." They talked long into the night, making plans. Pierce owned a cabin in the high country, a solid structure he had built himself near a creek that ran year-round. He had a good trap line, made enough from furs to live comfortably. It would not be an easy life, but it would be theirs. Nora decided to sell the store. There was a merchant from Lead who had been making inquiries, a solid man with a family. Her father would have approved. She would use the money to buy supplies, things they would need for the cabin. Warm clothes, books, seeds for a garden. The thought of a garden, of growing something in this harsh land, filled her with unexpected joy. "When?" she asked. "When can we leave?" "Store will take time to sell," Pierce said practically. "And winter is coming. Better to wait until spring, do it right." Spring seemed impossibly far away, but Nora nodded. She had waited this long. She could wait a few more months. Pierce stayed in town that week, taking a room at Mrs. Murphy's boarding house. The widow was delighted, and Nora suspected she had been rooting for this romance from the beginning. He spent his days helping Nora with the store, and his presence alone was enough to discourage trouble. Word spread quickly that Pierce Patterson had claimed Nora Whitmore, and the men who might have tried their luck before suddenly discovered they had business elsewhere. In the evenings, they walked together through Deadwood, and Nora discovered what it felt like to be courted. Pierce brought her little gifts, things he had made or found. A hair comb carved from bone. A fox pelt, incredibly soft, that he said would make a warm collar for her coat. Wildflowers, dried and pressed, that he had gathered in the high meadows. And one evening, as they sat on the bench outside her store watching the sun set over the hills, he brought her something wrapped in cloth. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." She unwrapped it carefully and found a small wooden jar sealed with wax. "What is it, honey?" Pierce said. "Found a bee tree up in the mountains last summer. Took me half a day to get the comb out without getting stung to death, but it was worth it." Nora stared at the jar. "I have never had honey before." He looked surprised. "Never. My mother used to talk about it. She remembered having it as a child before the war, but it was too expensive for us. Father always said it was a luxury we could not afford." Pierce opened the jar, dipped his finger in, and held it out to her. "Taste it." Nora hesitated, then leaned forward and took his finger in her mouth. The honey was sweet, sweeter than anything she had ever tasted, with hints of wildflower and summer sunshine. It was like tasting happiness itself. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, Pierce, it is wonderful." He was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Your life has been hard, full of work and worry and going without. I want to change that. I want to make sure you have sweetness, that you have joy." Nora felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were happy tears. "You already have. Just by being here, you have made everything sweeter." He kissed her then, and she could taste the honey on his lips, could feel the promise of all the sweetness to come. The winter of 1878 was one of the coldest on record in the Black Hills. Snow fell early and deep, and Deadwood became isolated as the passes closed. Pierce stayed in town, unable to return to his cabin even if he wanted to. He and Nora spent nearly every day together, and the townsfolk watched their courtship with approval. There had been too much violence, too much hardness in Deadwood. A love story was a welcome change. Pierce taught Nora how to shoot properly, not just how to point a shotgun, but how to handle a rifle, how to track and hunt. They would go out into the hills when the weather allowed, and he showed her his world. He taught her how to read animal signs, how to find water, how to move quietly through the forest. He showed her where the bee tree was, a massive old pine with a hollow full of honeycomb, and promised that next summer they would harvest it together. Nora taught Pierce to read better. He knew his letters but had never had much use for books. She read to him in the evenings and watched his face light up as she introduced him to stories and poems, to worlds beyond the mountains. His favorite was a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe that her father had kept behind the counter, and Nora loved watching this powerful man become absorbed in the adventures of a shipwrecked sailor. They talked about everything. About the war, which Pierce had fought in as a young man. About the things he had seen, the things he had done, the reasons he had fled to the wilderness. About Nora's childhood, her mother's death, her father's dreams. About their hopes for the future, the life they would build together. And slowly, as the snow piled high and the nights grew long, they fell completely in love. It was Christmas Eve when Pierce asked her to marry him. They were in the back room of the store, warm by the stove while a blizzard raged outside. Nora was mending one of Pierce's shirts, trying to patch a tear in the sleeve when he reached over and stilled her hands. "Nora." She looked up. He was nervous, she realized with surprise. This man who faced down outlaws without flinching was nervous. "I know we said we would wait until spring," he began, "but I have been thinking. Why wait? Why waste another minute when we could be married, could be building our life together?" "Pierce, I love you," he said, the words tumbling out like he had been holding them back too long. "I love you more than I thought I could love anything. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes. I love how you look at the world, finding beauty even here. I love everything about you, and I do not want to spend another day without you being mine in every way that matters." He pulled something from his pocket, a ring carved from a piece of antler, polished smooth and inlaid with a thin line of gold. "I made this for you." "It is not much, but it is perfect," Nora interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "And yes, yes, I will marry you. I do not want to wait either." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. "Tomorrow," he asked. "The preacher is here, stuck by the storm. We could do it tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she agreed. They were married on Christmas Day in the small church at the edge of town, with Mrs. Murphy and the sheriff as witnesses. Nora wore her best dress, dark blue wool that she had pressed carefully, and Pierce had trimmed his beard and hair and looked almost civilized in a clean shirt. The preacher was delighted to perform a wedding instead of a funeral for once, and when Pierce kissed his bride, the small congregation cheered. Mrs. Murphy insisted on hosting a wedding dinner, and half the town showed up, bringing what food they could spare. It was not fancy, but it was joyful, and Nora had never felt more loved or more certain that she had made the right choice. That night, Pierce carried her over the threshold of the small room he had rented, and Nora discovered that the sweetness of honey was nothing compared to the sweetness of being loved by a good man. Spring came late to the Black Hills in 1879, but when it finally arrived, Nora and Pierce were ready. The store sold to the merchant from Lead for a fair price, and Nora spent the money carefully, buying everything they would need: flour and sugar, coffee and tea, seeds for the garden, tools and supplies, bolts of cloth and needles and thread. She bought books, because she could not imagine a life without them, and Pierce bought traps and ammunition and the things he would need for his work. On the first day of May, they loaded a mule with their supplies and set out for the high country. The journey took 3 days, following narrow trails that climbed steadily upward. Pierce led the way, and Nora followed, learning to move with the rhythm of the mountains. They camped at night under the stars, and Pierce showed her constellations she had never noticed before, told her the stories behind their names. On the 3rd day, they came over a rise and Nora saw the cabin. It was not large, just a single room with a sleeping loft, but it was solid and well built, situated in a clearing beside a creek. The logs were chinked tight against the weather, and there was a good stone fireplace at one end. Behind the cabin was a shed for storing furs and tools, and beyond that, a meadow that would be perfect for a garden. "It is beautiful," Nora said, and meant it. Pierce looked relieved. "It is rough, not like the town. It is perfect." They spent the next weeks making the cabin into a home. Nora planted her garden, and Pierce built a fence to keep the deer out. She made curtains for the windows and cushions for the rough chairs. He built her a shelf for her books and a table where she could work. Together they made the cabin comfortable, filling it with small touches that made it theirs. The work was hard but satisfying. Nora learned to live by the rhythm of the seasons, to wake with the sun and sleep when it set. She learned to make soap and candles, to preserve food for the winter, to cook over an open fire. Pierce taught her to fish and to trap small game, and she proved to be a quick study. In June, they harvested the honey from the bee tree. Pierce showed her how to smoke the bees, how to carefully remove the comb without destroying the hive. They collected nearly 2 gallons of honey, rich and golden, and Nora felt a deep satisfaction in this harvest. This was the sweetness Pierce had promised her, earned by their own hands. She learned to bake with the honey, making cakes and breads that filled the cabin with wonderful smells. She made mead, a honey wine that Pierce said was the best he had ever tasted. and on their first anniversary, she made honeyed flapjacks for breakfast, remembering that day when Pierce had first fed her, when he had started to make her life sweet. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small joys. Winters were hard, but they faced them together, keeping each other warm through the long, dark months. Springs were a time of renewal, of planting and planning. Summers were busy with work, checking the trap lines, tending the garden, preserving food. Falls were golden, a time of harvest and preparation. In the spring of 1880, Nora realized she was with child. She told Pierce one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. He went very still, then turned to look at her with wonder in his eyes. "A baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "In the fall, I think." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so carefully like she might break. "Nora, oh Nora, you have made me the happiest man alive." "I am a little scared," she admitted. "I know. But you are the strongest woman I know, and I will be here. Every step of the way," he was. As her belly grew round and her movements became awkward, Pierce took on more of the heavy work. He fussed over her like a mother hen, making sure she ate enough, that she rested enough. He built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there was not a single rough edge. Nora sewed tiny clothes from soft cloth, and they talked about names, about the future, about what kind of life they wanted for this child. Their son was born in October, during the first snow of the year. The birth was hard, and there were moments when Nora thought she might not survive it. But Pierce was there, holding her hand, giving her his strength, and when their baby finally came into the world, letting out a lusty cry that echoed off the cabin walls, Nora felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. They named him Peter Samuel, after his father and grandfather, and he was perfect. He had Pierce's pale blue eyes and Nora's blonde hair, and from the start, he was strong and healthy. Pierce was a devoted father. He would spend hours with Peter, talking to him, singing to him in a surprisingly good voice, teaching him about the world. As Peter grew, Pierce made him toys carved from wood, animals and people that the boy loved. He told him stories about the mountains, about the animals that lived there, about the importance of respecting the land. Nora watched her husband with their son and fell even more in love with him. This massive, powerful man was so gentle with their child, so patient and kind. He would let Peter climb all over him, laughing when the boy pulled his hair or poked at his beard. He would carry Peter on his shoulders as he checked the trap lines, pointing out tracks and teaching him the names of birds. In 1882, their daughter was born. They named her Nancy Grace, and she was delicate where her brother was sturdy, quiet where he was loud. She had Pierce's dark hair and Nora's features, and she wrapped her father around her tiny finger from the moment she opened her eyes. The cabin seemed smaller now with 4 of them, but happier. It was filled with the sounds of children laughing, of family. Pierce built an addition, another room where the children could sleep, and Nora made it cozy with quilts and the few toys they had. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when food ran low, when they worried about whether they had enough to make it through. There were illnesses that scared them, fevers that had Nora sitting up all night with a sick child. There were accidents, injuries that came from living in a wild place. But there was also joy. So much joy. There were summer evenings when they would all go down to the creek, and Pierce would teach the children to fish while Nora waded in the shallows. There were winter nights when they would gather around the fire, and Nora would read to them while Pierce whittled, and the children played at their feet. There were spring mornings when they would work in the garden together, Peter helping his father build the fence higher while Nancy helped Nora plant seeds. And every June, they would harvest honey from the bee tree together. It became a tradition, a family ritual. Pierce would smoke the bees while Peter watched in fascination, and Nancy hid behind Nora's skirts. They would carefully remove the comb, just enough to fill their jars but leaving plenty for the bees. Then they would sit in the meadow and taste the new honey, and Nora would tell the children about the first time their father had brought her honey, about how she had never tasted anything so sweet. Peter was 8 and Nancy was 6 when they made their first trip to Deadwood as a family. The town had grown, become more civilized. There were schools now and churches and actual law. The wild days were fading, though the stories remained. They stayed with Mrs. Murphy, who was delighted to see them. She had grown old, her hair completely white now, but her spirit was unchanged. She fussed over the children, spoiling them with sweets and attention. "Look at you," she said to Nora. "Look at the life you have built. Your father would be so proud." Nora thought he would be. She had not followed his dream, but she had found her own. She had found love and happiness in a place she never expected, with a man who made sure her life was sweet in every way that mattered. On their last evening in town, Pierce took Nora to the hillside where her father was buried. The grave was well tended, the stone weathered but readable. Nora laid wildflowers on it, and Pierce stood beside her, his hand warm in hers. "Thank you," she said to her father, to the wind, to the mountains. "Thank you for bringing me here, for leading me to him." Pierce squeezed her hand. "Ready to go home?" "Yes." They returned to the cabin, to their life in the mountains, and the years continued to pass. Peter grew tall and strong, learning his father's skills, becoming a skilled trapper in his own right. Nancy was quieter but equally capable, learning from her mother how to tend the garden, how to preserve food, how to make a home in the wilderness. In 1888, when Peter was 18 and Nancy 16, a young woman came to the cabin. She was the daughter of another trapper, and she had gotten lost in the mountains. Peter found her, brought her home, and from the way he looked at her, Nora knew. She saw the same expression on his face that Pierce must have worn when he first saw her. The girl's name was Emma, and she was sweet and brave and perfect for Peter. Her father came to collect her, and when he left, he gave Peter permission to court his daughter. Within a year they were married, and Peter built his own cabin a few miles from theirs. Nancy met a young farmer from one of the new settlements in the valley. He was steady and kind, and when he asked for her hand, Pierce gave it, though Nora could see it broke his heart a little to let his little girl go. But that was the way of things. Children grew up and found their own paths, their own loves, their own dreams. Pierce and Nora were alone again in the cabin, just the two of them as they had started. But they were not the same people they had been. They were older, slower, marked by years of hard work and harder winters. Pierce's hair was more gray than brown now, and Nora's blonde had faded to silver. But when he looked at her, she still saw the same love in his eyes that had been there from the beginning. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, these final years. Pierce still checked his trap lines, though not as often or as far. Nora still tended her garden, though it was smaller now. They still harvested honey every June, though it took them longer, their hands not as steady as they once were. In the spring of 1895, Peter and Emma gave them their first grandchild, a boy they named Pierce. Nora held him and marveled at the circle of life, at how this tiny baby represented everything she and Pierce had built together. Nancy had children too, 3 of them in quick succession, and suddenly Pierce and Nora found themselves surrounded by grandchildren every time they ventured into town, or when the families came to visit. The cabin that had been quiet was filled with noise again, with laughter and chaos and joy. Pierce was a wonderful grandfather, just as he had been a wonderful father. He would take the children on walks through the forest, showing them the same things he had shown Peter and Nancy. He carved them toys and told them stories and loved them with his whole heart. Nora watched him with their grandchildren and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what she had wanted, what she had dreamed of even when she had not known she was dreaming. A family, a legacy, love that would continue beyond her years. It was the summer of 1899 when Pierce started to slow down. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual diminishing. He got tired more easily, needed more rest. Nora watched him with worry, but he brushed off her concerns. "I am just getting old, love," he said. "It happens to everyone." But in the fall, he developed a cough that would not go away. By winter, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. Peter wanted to take him to a doctor in Deadwood, but Pierce refused. "I am not leaving these mountains," he said. "I came here to live, and I will die here too." Nora nursed him through that winter, doing everything she could to make him comfortable. Peter and Nancy came to visit when they could, bringing the grandchildren, and Nora could see them saying goodbye even though no one spoke the words aloud. On a clear day in February, with the sun shining bright on the snow, Pierce called Nora to his bedside. "Come here," he said, his voice weak but still that same deep rumble she had fallen in love with. She sat beside him, taking his hand. It was still large, still strong despite his illness, and she held it like a lifeline. "I want you to know," Pierce said, "that these past 20 years have been the best of my life. You gave me everything I did not know I needed. A home, a family, love, purpose. Pierce, let me finish." He smiled, that transforming smile that still made her heart skip. "You were this brave, stubborn girl trying to survive in a world that wanted to break you, and I thought I was saving you, bringing you honey, making sure you ate. But you saved me, Nora. You saved me from a life alone, from becoming something hard and bitter. You taught me how to live again." Tears were streaming down Nora's face. "I do not want to lose you. You will not. I will always be with you in this cabin we built together, in our children, in every sweet thing you taste. I will be in the mountains and the trees and the sky. You just have to look for me." "I will," she promised. "Always." He squeezed her hand. "Tell me again. Tell me about the first time you tasted honey." So she did. She told him about that evening on the bench outside her store, about how he had held out his finger, and she had tasted sweetness for the first time in her life. About how it had been the beginning of everything. Pierce listened, his eyes closed, a peaceful expression on his face. And when she finished, he opened his eyes one last time. "Sweet," he whispered. "Everything was so sweet." Then he was gone. Nora sat with him for a long time, holding his hand, memorizing his face. When Peter and Nancy arrived, summoned by some instinct that their father needed them, they found her there, dry-eyed and calm. They buried Pierce on the hillside overlooking the cabin, in a spot where he could see the mountains he had loved. Nora stood at the grave with her children and grandchildren around her, and she did not cry. Pierce would not have wanted tears. He would have wanted her to remember the joy, the sweetness, the love. After the funeral, Peter tried to convince her to come live with him and Emma. "You should not be alone, Ma," he said. "Not up here." "I am not alone," Nora said. "He is here, and this is my home. I am staying." And she did. She lived in the cabin alone for another 10 years, tending her garden, harvesting honey, living by the rhythm she and Pierce had established together. Her children visited often, bringing the grandchildren, and Nora filled them with stories about their grandfather, about the man he had been, about the life they had built. She never remarried. The thought never even occurred to her. Pierce had been her love, her only love, and she was content with the time they had shared. In the summer of 1909, when Nora was 73 years old, she went to harvest honey from the bee tree. It was something she had done every year since Pierce died. her way of honoring him, of keeping their tradition alive. But this year, climbing to the tree, she felt tired. She sat down in the meadow to rest, the same meadow where she and Pierce had first tasted honey together 30 years before. The sun was warm on her face, and she could hear the creek babbling nearby, and she felt a deep peace settle over her. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. When Peter found her the next day, she was still sitting in the meadow, a slight smile on her face, a jar of honey clutched in her hands. He knew immediately that she was gone, and though his heart broke, he also felt a strange joy. She had died in the place she loved, doing something that had meaning, surrounded by beauty. They buried her next to Pierce on the hillside, and the whole family came. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had taught them about strength and love and finding sweetness, even in hard places. Years passed. The cabin remained, maintained by Peter and then by his children. It became a place where the family gathered, where they told stories about Pierce and Nora, about the love that had endured through hardship and time. The bee tree continued to produce honey, and every June, the family would harvest it together, remembering the tradition that had started so long ago. The story of the mountain man and the girl he had saved became family legend, told and retold with each generation. About how Pierce had brought Nora honey when she had never tasted it before, and how he had spent the rest of his life making sure she always had sweetness. About how their love had created a legacy that continued long after they were gone. In the meadow where Nora had died, wildflowers grew in profusion, and bees hummed among them, making honey from the blooms. The creek still babbled, the mountains still stood watch, and in the wind, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear laughter, the sound of a man and a woman who had found everything they needed in each other. The cabin still stood 100 years later, maintained now by descendants who barely remembered the original stories, but felt the love that had built it. They would bring their children there in summer, teach them to fish in the creek, to respect the mountains, to appreciate the simple sweetness of honey fresh from the comb. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun painted the sky in gold and crimson, visitors to the cabin swore they could see two figures standing on the hillside. A massive man with long hair and a woman beside him, her hand in his, both of them looking out over the valley they had loved. Just for a moment, and then they were gone, like mist burning off in the morning sun, but the feeling remained. The sense of enduring love, of promises kept, of a life well lived. The knowledge that sometimes the sweetest things in life come from the most unexpected places, that love can bloom even in the hardest soil, that one act of kindness can change everything. Pierce Patterson had brought honey to a starving girl in Deadwood, South Dakota in 1878, and in doing so, had started a love story that would echo through generations. He had promised to make her life sweet, and he had kept that promise every single day until his last breath. And Nora Whitmore had been brave enough to accept that sweetness, to trust in a mountain man who saw her worth when she could barely see it herself. She had chosen love over security, adventure over safety, and had never regretted it for a single moment. Their story ended the way all love stories should, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with a quiet contentment, with lives fully lived, with children and grandchildren who carried their love forward into the future. It ended with sweetness, just as it had begun, honey on the tongue and love in the heart, lasting long after the final sunset, echoing forever in the mountains they had called home. And somewhere in the Black Hills, the bees still make honey, golden and sweet, a reminder that even in the hardest places, sweetness can be found. You just have to be brave enough to taste it, and lucky enough to find someone who wants to share it with you, making sure your life is sweet from that moment forward, forever and always.